So welcome to those of you watching us online. I'm Adam Huttler. I'm the Executive Director of Fractured Atlas. Welcome both online viewers and people in the room to the Fractured Atlas office in New York City, where we're hosting today's issue brunch. It's a little late for brunch, but what the heck. I believe it's called Data Sharing. Do we have to? Just a quick note, when this is all done, or shortly thereafter, there will be a version of this, I think actually an HD version, posted on YouTube. So if you missed something, you can go back and check it out. Anyway, with that, I'm going to hand it to David Dombrosky, our moderator.
Hi, so I'm David, and I'm with the Center for Arts Management and Technology at Carnegie Mellon University. And I'm just going to have us go around the table and introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about the work we do as it pertains to today's topic of data sharing, and do you have to? Or do you already? So I guess we'll start with Deborah Abramson.
Sure. I work with the Cultural Data Project at the Pew Charitable Trust, managing technology on that project. The Cultural Data Project, or CDP, gathers data from nonprofit arts and cultural organizations, and then allows those organizations to share that data with funders, and also it's used for research and advocacy. So at the moment, our data sharing, we're thinking, about how this will evolve over time, but at the moment we're doing all of our data sharing through pretty manual processes involving research licenses and organizations manually or via PDF submitting data to funders. So we're still at a very in the initial stages of data sharing and being really cautious about it. So.
I'm Mara Smith, and I am an account executive at Situation Interactive. We're a full-service interactive marketing agency for live entertainment, and including for-profit and nonprofit arts. And when it comes to data sharing, for my for-profit clients, we don't share, really. But we do work closely with vendors like Ticketmaster for mailing lists and things like that. So when it comes to data sharing, that's sort of where we kind of fall the line. For our nonprofit, Live Arts, we do a lot of Tessitura data collecting through that. So that's where I stand.
I'm Barbara Chanowitz, and I run a grant program for the Theater Subdistrict Council, which is an organization in New York City that funds a number of arts groups throughout the city with funding that comes through the sale of Broadway theater's air rights to developers. Anyhow, I'm here as a funder, I'm here as an interested party. We would like to help facilitate our grantees' data to be shared with city agencies, with other arts organizations, and other interested parties.
And in terms of Center for Arts Management and Technology, much like Maris, our clients really don't share. And have yet to really express an interest in sharing data. But from another perspective, from our technology and the arts kind of service arm, we do a lot of manual collection of data from across the field through surveying and whatnot. But it would be so much nicer if that was all automated and aggregated and didn't require us to do it manually all of the time. That would be lovely. Chris.
I'm Chris Mackey. I'm Executive Director of Collaboration Source, which is a nonprofit that helps mission-driven organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, and government agencies to transform themselves and their sectors by engaging differently with information technologies. So we use an approach called community sourcing, which involves bringing organizations together collaboratively to design, build, own, govern, sustain, and enhance technology going forward. So we share aggressively. I mean, it's literally impossible not to share information and to share data given the kinds of work that we do and the way that we do it. And I've been doing that for, I don't know, on and off for the better part of a decade now. Before this, I was at the Mellon Foundation, where we built a lot of the projects that use community sourcing. So there are about 25,000 nonprofits worldwide, serving somewhere between 30 and 50 million people a day who use these technologies, and all of them are involved in one way or another with data sharing.
I'm Joe Harrell. I'm Director of Marketing and Product Management at Alliance for the Arts. I'm the product manager for NYCRS, so data sharing is very much germane to what we do. Essentially, NYCRS, the philosophy behind it is that the sum is greater than, no, sorry, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's what I get for using a cliche. So, you know, the sort of everything we're trying to accomplish with NYCRS in terms of promotion of the nonprofit cultural sector, as well as leveraging the database that drives all of that work, which includes CDP-like data, you know, and other sort of quantitative information. All of that drives our research and the promotional tools. It must be shared in order for it to exist. And we feel like sort of what is lost, I guess, by an individual nonprofit arts group is gained, you know, with far greater impact by the fact that you now have sort of the force of an entire sector marching in the right direction, you know, in the same direction in order to gain visibility and other things that an individual, probably the majority of the individual arts groups, wouldn't be able to accomplish on their own.
So you heard me say earlier, Adam Huttler, Executive Director of Fractured Atlas. We're a national arts service organization. We have a couple of big projects right now that I think are particularly relevant to this conversation. The first is the Athena project. This is a community-designed open source software framework for the arts and cultural sector that has been in development for about a year now, and we're getting pretty close to a launch date, so that's exciting. But that hopefully will, a lot of what we're building with that, you know, we're thinking about data and data sharing and data syndication, you know, as a kind of fundamental part of the design process, and how can we facilitate that, and how can we help organizations have more sort of fine-grained control over what they share and with whom. So these are questions that we're sort of asking ourselves along the way. And then the second project that's really relevant to this is a suite of online applications that we've developed called Archipelago. These are all about data aggregation, data visualization, analysis, and kind of use in a decentralized way. I realize that's all terribly abstract, but we can get into some of the specifics later on if it becomes relevant. But the point is, you know, that project absolutely depends on being able to, you know, pull in data from other existing sources, including, say, the IRS's business master file, to Cultural Data Project, which we're working with you guys in California, you know, to our own online database of performance and rehearsal spaces, you name it. There's a policy map where we're using to get demographic data to provide a sort of demographic context to some of the information on where arts organizations cluster, things like that. So, you know, so that work is completely dependent on the ability to access good information wherever we can, and also hopefully can serve as, you know, something like a clearinghouse almost for being able to then redistribute or re-syndicate that information to, you know, anyone who wants to use it. So yeah.
So I wanted to start with a question, and it'll be interesting, especially given, you know, aggressive data sharing over here, and Mayor's like, no, we don't share. So my question is, you know, what data is worth sharing, and what data should not be shared?
Well, there are some obvious legal answers to what data should not be shared, right? Yeah.
Sure.
Credit card information is a bad thing to publish on the web, generally. Privacy-related information, personal identifying information, it poses some very serious challenges for organizations. And it gets very much to the question of cost, because disidentifying information before you put it out on the web for some organizations is a huge overhead cost for this kind of thing. In terms of what should be shared, you know, I'm a big believer that it should be mission-driven. I mean, I think that if you can express in some reasonable way a measurable strategic objective that's advanced for your organization by sharing information, then that information ought to be shared, if you can find a way to do it affordably.
I 100% agree with you, Chris. And in terms of what we can and can't share, I also think that location-based is going to be a huge hot topic in the next few months, especially with all the location-based social media going on, and people not being aware that now when they're checking in, particularly on certain places, that's also sharing where they are located. And I think there's going to be a lot of close eyes on that type of topic. But it helps you though with mailing lists and trying to grab that target audience as well. So be curious to see how that plays into effect as well.
Chris sort of touched on the idea of kind of anonymizing data. I mean, I think it's almost like two different questions, right? I mean, what data is helpful to have out there in the aggregate, you know, for research purposes or for comparative purposes, you know, versus what data, like a mailing list data, right? What data is only meaningful if it's very much not anonymous and very specific. And there are obviously different sort of challenges associated with sharing both of those.
I have a related question, actually. You mentioned, I think it was with Athena, but maybe one of the other projects you mentioned, that you're going about the process of figuring out what people would share. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about, because we have, you know, a lot of similar concerns, how you're going about figuring that out, or figuring out what the points of control are for people. And
I would say we're extremely early in that process, and I don't have any brilliant insights to offer, really. Other than that, I think as a very sort of general principle, I think the more that people feel comfortable that they have some idea of how the information is being used, who's seeing it, what they're using it for, you know, if people feel like they really own their own data and can control it, I think almost, you know, paradoxically perhaps they become more comfortable letting go of it and letting it out there because it's just less scary. So there's a lot of psychology, you know, involved in it. I think probably you've got a tough challenge because they know that the audience is funders, and everybody's terrified of their funders knowing anything other than their spin, you know?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And yet, ironically, the data is publicly available.
Of course it is.
Right. But at the same time, it's this compilation that seems to have another power, and there is a lot of fear, I think, and we're spending a lot of time really wanting to, you know, reinforce for organizations that.
I was going to say, with CDP, how much time do you spend as therapists? I mean, really, with all the calls, because having gone through the CDP process, I can tell you there is a certain amount of anxiety figuring out, okay, how do I do this exactly right? And every year, I know I'm not doing it exactly right, because I get the call going, yeah, that's really probably not where you want to put that, you know? So, I mean, I know there's got to be a lot of angst around that type of data sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're so hands-on with our data even once it's submitted. As you know, you get phone calls and email. We will chase you down until we think that you have the data right. And so our help desk does spend a lot of time, you know, sort of addressing people's concerns as best they can. I
just think it's you know, there's a lot of, when data sharing conversations often begin with someone who has an agenda around the notion of information wanting to be free. And I think one of the most important lessons from people who've actually done data sharing is that data shared information wants to be very, very expensive.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a constant challenge to keep the curation costs down, to actually, I mean, we spend a fair amount of time with the projects putting together administrative systems that simply reduce the transaction costs of generating transparent information in the first place. Because if you have to fix the data, you almost certainly can't sustain a data sharing arrangement, right? If the data can't be made seamlessly available for sharing, then you are already in a very bad place in terms of in terms of trying to come up with any truly sustainable regimen for what you're trying to accomplish.
So a sort of concept that I've been sort of evangelizing about quite a lot lately is something that we've sort of internally taken to calling organic data collection, right? Which is the idea that there's such sort of data entry fatigue out in the field. I mean, there's so many damn surveys that we're all expected to fill out, and different places where we have to report this and report that, and it's all really the same information. I mean, sometimes it's like slightly different in terms of the way that it's skewed or the angle or the exact question that's being asked, but basically the same information. So, you know, anytime we're working on a project where data is a major component, to the extent possible, we try to make that problem, you know, better and not worse. I mean, people are creating data all the time, right? Anytime a ticket is sold or a donation is made or something is accounted for in somebody's accounting system, you know, the data is being created. It just seems like sometimes we need just better systems for capturing it in passing and putting it out there, or just providing kind of natural and not contrived sort of business incentives for participating. You know, so for example, right, so we have this, I mentioned we have this online database of performance and rehearsal spaces for rent. We have it here in New York City. We're also working with partners in the San Francisco Bay Area, Philadelphia, and a few other cities are going to be coming online over the next year. Part of the system that we're building right now is actually a centralized reservation engine and sort of rental transaction system. And a lot of the support for this is actually coming from Theater Sub-District Council. There's going to be a tremendous amount of data that comes out of this as kind of a natural byproduct of people conducting business without, they're not thinking of this as a data entry tool or as a data collection mechanism. They're thinking about this is a cool, more efficient way of renting out my space or of renting space. But of course, you know, when you look at all the data that comes out of it, you get a tremendous amount of information about sort of supply and demand in the market for space in the performing arts. You get to know what are people searching for but not finding. You know, what are the geographic areas in terms of the ratio of, you know, square footage of available space to population. There's all sorts of interesting things there. So I think we need to make it easier for people. We need to reduce those barriers.
So we think of data sharing in I think, a broader context than we're discussing here, because it seems like we're addressing data as sort of numbers, right? Numbers about an institution or a person or like specific facts that can be quantified. And with NYCRS, I didn't do a great job of sort of establishing what that is. So essentially, it was started as what was called the citywide cultural database. A database of information about 1,400 plus organizations in New York City that was originally meant to drive the research work that the Alliance for the Arts has done since the 70s. It evolved into what is now today NYCRS, a big database again that is populated primarily via a content management system that the organizations input information into, and what can come out of it is programming information, all the sort of logistical facts and hours about an organization, and we put that on NYCRS, NYC Kids Arts, the NYCRS iPhone app, out via RSS feeds and widgets. And so with that, we very much sort of take the approach that in order for this project to be worth anything, we need to be sharing data. And it isn't a question of do we, but how do we do that the best? And so that people will pick it up rather than going to an organization and taxing them some more and asking them for the same information that we're asking them to put in this database. Because we find that even among art service groups, you know, a single performing arts institution probably gets on a monthly basis 5 requests for the same type of data. You know? And I don't think that's an exaggeration in New York City, because we're really ambitious. You know, we all want to do research projects or post this or whatever, help out in some way. But we, you know, in some ways we're only making administrators' jobs harder. And when you're you know, a mid to small size nonprofit arts group that has a staff of 2, literally, the artistic directors having to do all of this stuff, right? So any information that we get, you know, we want to say, okay, how many eyeballs can we get this out to? And so sort of now, as we really look to find the return on the investment that the city made in this database, we look to how do we get this to the Times? how do we get this time out to all of these others outlets so that organization X, Y, and Z don't have to go there themselves.
So you're kind of talking about the purposes of data sharing. Like, for example, the purposes I'm hearing from you are about leveraging communication.
Exactly.
As you know, it's for some other data sharing projects, it might be much more about research, about the field, and about getting mapping the environment of the field. So I mean, yeah, there's different purposes. Absolutely.
Right. There's also different information architectures because this is a portal style project, right? This sort of a hub and spoke model where everything's coming in and being delivered centrally and then being consumed from a central point. But there's also peer-to-peer data sharing, right? There's also all kinds of sort of ad hoc data sharing arrangements. There's very heavy formal institutionalized data sharing of this type, which usually involves some kind of significant subsidy. There are all kinds of lightweight data sharing options where a couple of organizations just decide to swap mailing lists or things like that. So it's a really complex space, and the issues are very different in different parts of that space. But one of the things that is consistent is that, and I think you were just alluding to this, is that the total cost of data sharing for large organizations is higher, but the fractional cost of data sharing for small organizations tends to be much higher. It's easy for a higher education institution to share data. They have whole divisions of people fully staffed and paid to share information, right? They have academics who are professional information sharers with pre-built networks. You ask us a two-person arts organization to honor the same request, and you're actually imposing a substantial burden on that organization. So when you're thinking about how you want to do this, I mean, I hate to sound like the geek in the room, but there are information architecture concerns here that go beyond any single organization, that go to what's the mission objective for the individual organization, but also what's in the collective interest of the sector. How do we think about putting these kinds of arrangements together? Can we do it ad hoc? If we can, that's always cheaper. Do we need some kind of formalized coordination? Do we need something like NYCRS or CDP? If so, we've got to find somebody who's willing to pay those costs, because those costs are considerable.
And I think we need to recognize that whatever we do is never going to be the end of the story. And what I mean by that is, we can sort of claim that we're going to have control over the data that's collected in the CDP, but the fact of the matter is, Web 2.0 is very open, right? We're well into that. Nobody claims to have control over a fact or a bit of conversation, and any marketer who does is, really sort of behind the curve. So I think of data sharing in the same way, that we can be really careful and cautious about stuff that one person or one group may be sensitive about because they don't really understand where it's going, or we can say, it's going to be out there. Let's get ahead of the conversation, get control over the message that comes through this data, and actually offer it up. And again, it's very abstract, and that sort of philosophy sort of has very different ramifications on the type of data sharing you're doing, right, whether it's a mailing list or confidential information. But anything that isn't confidential, the idea that we own a piece of content is quickly becoming sort of obsolete.
Or at least it's becoming substantially more sophisticated than it used to be, right? I mean,
yeah, it has to be.
I think one of the fun things about what I do is that you get to work across nonprofit sectors. And so I think I've done a data sharing project in just about every sector except social services at this point. And there are some things that are consistent, and one is that almost everyone starts out with, oh, no. Right. No. I mean, I think about art museums who were persuaded that if they just put a low-resolution picture of a painting up on the web, all traffic into the building would immediately cease, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the lessons are always subtly different in different sectors, but they're inevitably, on any reasonably high level of abstraction, the same, which is that sharing this information is not necessarily a net loss to the organization. It's often a substantial net benefit. I mean, every study that museums have ever commissioned suggests that you put more on the web, you get more people in the door. You know.
But if you're talking about beginning the process of data sharing amongst organizations, how do you get past that initial no?
And this barrier, it's a huge barrier for a small organization, for whom it doesn't feel like data sharing, it feels like data giving.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And I think in former life at a service organization, I was very involved with data collection and sharing. And when we were able to show the organizations how they could use that data and how they could pull out theirs or pull out groups or subsets, when it became really a two-way situation, then it became a lot easier to get that.
It's why a lot of the most effective, the real world's data sharing successes fall into two categories. They fall into the ad hoc emergent networks where people found, your mom has some costumes, my dad has a barn, let's put on a show, those kinds of data sharing activities, the Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland school of data sharing. And those often grow organically. People are getting mutual benefit from the inception, so it's never really a calculus of, oh gosh, how do we figure out how to sustain this? How do we figure out how to make money? And that's true in every sector. I guess my experience is a little bit different in that I think that in general, smaller organizations in most sectors have been quicker to embrace data sharing. It's the larger organizations that tend to perceive they have more to lose because they own more to start. And so I certainly see the psychodynamics that you describe in individual organizations, but on balance, a lot of the innovation around data sharing in almost every sector I've seen has come it's certainly not from the top tier, maybe not from the absolute bottom tier, but somewhere in the middle. Organizations that feel like they can improve their stature if they use data sharing as a way to get themselves better known in the world.
Is there a generational component to this? I think my impression certainly is that folks I talk to under age 30 have sort of come of age in an environment where sharing everything is just the normal, natural, obvious thing to do. To the point that there are kind of problematic implications sometimes for teenagers or people who have that sort of general philosophy, but not necessarily the maturity to really understand the nuances. Certainly, I think the default in older generations, which probably are the folks in leadership positions in those larger institutions, there's less intuitive comfort, I think, with these ideas.
I wouldn't, in all fairness, I resist the notion that it's generational because I know plenty of folks in their 80s who are leading this charge. I think that it's more an issue of acculturation. I think there is a seniority effect here because the longer you've spent in a sector that doesn't believe in data sharing, the more acculturated you are to not sharing data. But the contrast between education as a space and the arts as a space, or cultural heritage as a space. Education, transparency of information is just taken for granted. If you don't publish something, it has no value. So there's an ownership. There are very strong norms around plagiarism, around credit and citation, and they've evolved ways to ensure that people are protected in sharing their information in ways that are of value to them. But I really think that while there is some correlation between age and interest, I think that it's really unfair to stereotype it as being in any meaningful way a function of age. A lot of these 20-somethings, give them 10 years in a museum. And you may find that work experiences are powerful socializing environments.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Miris, looking at the kind of the limits of the comfort zone in terms of sharing, but also going back to Chris's point about working within an industry or a sector that doesn't share data and is culturated not to share data with one another, particularly thinking about for-profit industries and the concept of sharing data. Do you want to talk to the resistance factor?
Oh, sure. Well, it's very simple. And also my former life, I came from a nonprofit service organization as well, so that was data sharing was key. And we faced similar problems where it was actually the smaller members were the ones that were on board immediately. It was the larger, more reputably known, institutionalized organizations that sort of were hesitant to buy in, and it took a lot of trust and negotiating, and then having the data eventually to back it up and prove that it worked in order to get them to buy in, and they did eventually. In for-profit field, I mean, it's very simple. It's a ticket buyer or a patron is sort of like a funder, and you want to protect that information. And the last thing you want to do is share information that somebody does not want to be sharing their information with, and feeling violated and feeling sort of almost like put on the spot, and then they just get turned off all completely. I think that's the fear, and that's where it comes to privacy settings, information settings, just to make sure that your ticket buyers are sort of your funders, in fact. So,
Well, they're the only source of your revenue. So.
Absolutely. So without them, then your show's closing.
But your clients, they're sharing a lot of data, though, right? Which goes back to sort of what I was saying about what kind of data we're talking about. I mean, I come from the media world. I worked at Time Warner for 7.5 years and saw like the music business sort of fall apart because of kind of this philosophical discussion, right? They thought that they had control over all of their data, where some kids said, okay, sure, we're going to put up Napster, and now you'll see exactly how much control you have over your data. And if they had sort of jumped on board and changed their philosophy earlier on, people would have adopted sort of them as the go-to source for this content or this information.
You're sort of touching upon content and
exactly
and arts. I mean, it's not that necessarily we are sharing data to an extent, but with our clients, but it's more we keep it anonymous. We protect. We want to protect people's information and our clients' information as well. But it's not like we're broadcasting the entire play on YouTube and therefore sort of shooting us in the foot. You don't want to do that. I think with Napster was, as someone who's in college and enjoyed the benefits of Napster very, very much, it is a shame that they had an opportunity there, the music industry. They could have jumped on and done something about that. Instead, they wanted to try and shut it down and look away, and I think it did.
Do you know that if you put it on the web, it will actually hurt you? Do you know if you put the whole performance out there?
I put a lot of stuff on the web for my clients. That's sort of what we do. And one of the fundamental arguments I always hear from a new client is, oh, don't put that piece on YouTube.
Well, I was going to say, The Lion King was a pretty successful motion picture. You can get it on DVD for, what, $9 at Walmart these days, I imagine, and yet it doesn't seem to hurt the ticketed sales for the Broadway show, right?
Well, The Lion King on DVD is no Julie Taymor production.
Okay.
Exactly.
Well, but a YouTube Julie Taymor production isn't a Julie Taymor production either.
My point is exactly that, it's this fear that if we put the picture up, nobody will come through the door again.
Right, absolutely.
And I've never seen anyone do a really rigorous test of that in the performing arts. I'd be really curious to know if anyone has been able to establish under what circumstances it's actually disadvantageous to do.
It's a work in progress. Yeah. It's a constant ebb and flow of what you want to put out there. You don't want to reveal the big secrets. You don't want. There's the constant fear that if you put that show for free on a platform like YouTube, therefore they will not buy tickets.
But the operative word here is fear.
Fear, absolutely.
It's not an evidence-based conclusion or analysis at this point. It's still very much just a bias toward the notion that we've never done it before, and probably we haven't done it because it's going to be bad.
Right. So. And in fact, we've seen benefits of.
Well, there's that, but there's also, there's a rational fear, and then there is somewhat rational fear, and the somewhat rational fear is if our assumption is true, what are the economic implications for our organization? You know what I mean? Like if we do the test and the test proves that yes, people do not buy tickets when they have this available online, then what position have we placed ourselves in by going through with the test? You know what I mean?
Then we're in a position to see what inevitably is going to come and disrupt our business and put us
Yes.
out of business.
Because if you don't do it, then you're the recording industry.
Exactly. Whereas,
And
if,
and the problem with the teasers and the loss leaders is that, once again, it sounds to me like you're more the recording industry than you are anything else. Because, at the end of the day, a really disruptive innovation like the changes in dissemination-related information technologies. I disagree with something you said earlier, and I'm looping back to it because it's germane right here, and that is the notion that if the music industry had just figured this out earlier, I honestly believe that the major recording organizations are going to ride the current business model down in flames, and I think they're going to do it because it's entirely rational for them to do so, because there's not going to be a single day between here and bankruptcy where they will make more money that day from the new model than they will from the existing model. Right? And when eventually they do ride it into bankruptcy, what will emerge in the aftermath is organizations that are built very, very differently from today's recording industry organizations.
Sure.
And I think you can make the same argument about arts organizations. And I think one of them, this is no longer a data sharing, this is now a policy discussion.
We've completely forgotten one other factor. Let's say we get all the arts organizations and music industry to buy in and put everything out on the internet. We forgot about the artists and their protection and other people's employees and unions, and you get into a whole can of worms about
That's huge.
Huge.
Yep.
and it is sort of the illegal activity or the disruptive technology that we don't initiate that actually forces those policies to change, unfortunately. I mean, if you look at the dissemination of a lot of protected content, and you have a union that won't budge, they're going to budge eventually when you show them that, well, sorry, your artist's work is it has no audience anymore. It has no paying audience because you're unwilling to change that policy. So I think, that's a huge point in my mind that we are scared of knowledge and sort of seeing that we're losing control. But knowing exactly how we're losing control is what's going to keep us ahead of the curve and ahead of our competitors, whoever those are.
The real risk here is this sort of counterfactual notion that somehow we can retain control, right?
Exactly.
The notion that if you simply never put, I want to keep using museums because in some ways it's easier to point fingers outside of the arts since we're talking about the arts, but if you never put the pictures up, then nothing bad will ever happen to you. Well, if you don't put the pictures up, pretty soon people forget about your museum, right? They'll go and they'll visit a museum that actually makes it engaging for them before they get there and after they leave.
Right.
So
They'll be looking at completely different things on their iPhone or through other sort of media consumption platforms.
yeah.
So if I was going to ask you in particular, going off of the idea of control and the notion, or perhaps the misperception that we can actually, retain control, and you were talking about working with organizations and trying to figure out levels of control.
Right. So obviously we've diverged a little bit, right? There's two different things that we're talking about. We're talking about sharing content, we're talking about sharing data. And I think there are areas where those are similar challenges and there are aspects of them that are really very different. I think underlying all this idea about fears about sharing content is the notion that somehow one's content is some kind of competitive advantage, some kind of special, unique thing that we have.
Well, it's almost that content is product.
Right, exactly, right? That's it, that's all we've got. And I think sometimes people feel that way about their data, right? They might feel that way about some kinds of data, maybe their mailing list or their donor database, something like that. But then, of course, there's also data like an event listing, where there are obvious and powerful incentives to get it out there as quickly and as ubiquitously as possible. So all of that said, going back to your question, which was what exactly? Which was
Going back to
how do you give people the control?
Going back to the issue of control, the misperception that we can retain control, especially with the idea of I'm giving data giving versus data sharing to a degree.
Right.
I'm giving data, now what happens to my data? How much of, I no longer get to control it?
So I think that's a really I don't have anything resembling an answer to that question with respect to content.
Right.
Because content is, it's an asymmetrical kind of relationship. I mean, like it's a totally, I mean, it's a consumer-producer sort of dynamic. With sort of other kinds of data and information, you know, I think it's about, you know, we talked about earlier, kind of identifying the value, you know, showing the use cases, and also, you know, there are pretty well established sort of pay-to-play models where, you know, if you participate in a system, you get information back. Google Analytics has a really neat feature where you can, you know, if you agree to share information on your web traffic with other Google Analytics users, you know, you get to compare how do you rank against these. And it's fun. It's fun to play with it. And you know, I certainly didn't bat an eye before opting into that because, I mean, how am I losing anything by sharing Fractured Atlas's web traffic anonymized with, you know, millions of Google Analytics.
So you just hit on a qualifier though.
Right.
It's anonymized.
It is anonymous.
It'd be totally different if they said, this is Fractured Atlas's data.
Absolutely.
Right.
Right.
Or if there were only 4 other organizations,
Right.
so that even
So
if
it'd
they
be
didn't
easy to
say
figure it out. Yes,
right.
exactly. Right. And
how many 4-person single choreography dance companies are there in New York
National
City?
service.
Right?
a lot, actually.
All right, bad example.
Yeah. So,
Move on.
you know, I think that, I mean, I think this is really hard, and I think, you know, Chris touched upon the sort of central broker hub and spoke model, you know, versus the sort of peer-to-peer. And there are different issues that come up in both of those. So CDP obviously is a hub and spoke model. You know, organizations participating in that, they have to trust the CDP with their data, and they have to trust that the CDP will honor the contract, essentially, to only use it in X, Y, and Z ways. And whether they're comfortable with X, Y, and Z ways or not, they at least know that that's what it's going to be. And if they don't trust CDP, then they're not going to participate. Well, of course, they have to participate if they want to get any money from anybody, but that's a different question.
Pay to play, sort of.
Yeah, that's right.
You play to get paid.
Play to maybe get paid, right?
Think of it as a nonprofit unfunded mandate.
Yes, exactly, right. With, you know, if we were to imagine, and I don't know if anything like this exists, or it's hard for me to think of anything existing that sort of follows this model, but a really sort of subtle peer-to-peer model that can, you know, I mean, I think of, you know, BitTorrent or something like that. I mean, it's sort of peer-to-peer, but it's very anonymized, and you don't necessarily know who you're sharing what with and what part of, you know. There may, I don't know, maybe there are ways of taking some of those ideas, some of those architectures, and applying them to this stuff. You would still need to have some kind of, you would either need to have some kind of central sort of information broker, or you'd have to have really well-established protocols and standards and sort of standard ways of describing data and standard protocols for interacting with it, which is of course how something like BitTorrent.
Not necessarily, at least not maybe quite as draconian as you're saying. There are examples, and they're growing in number, of data sharing models that admittedly start with an ontology, with some kind of agreed upon data model, but build into it the notion of extensibility. So there's sort of a core, think about Dublin core, you know, there's sort of a core set of fields without which you simply can't share the data. So there are fields about destination and origin and, you know, and that sort of thing, format information, that sort of stuff. Then there's a sort of a content core where anyone we can imagine wanting any data of this sort is going to want at least this subset of information. But then around that, there are extensible areas where different organizations can put in whatever may be of interest to them and share it with the notion that, you know, not everybody who gets this information is necessarily going to want all those ancillary pieces, but they have access to it.
So what comes to mind as you describe that is email, right? Is the email protocol, right? So there are there are protocols that were established a while ago for, for how do you send an email, and what does the mail server say to the other mail server in terms of negotiating that transaction. And as long as you're following those rules, anybody can send anybody else an email. And yeah, there are those sort of, you pretty much have to have a two, right? You have to, you should have a subject, you should have a body, but then yes, there is the ability to extend it, and different mail server products or things like that will do that.
And there's a lot of this kind of activity going on in different places, and it offers. I mean, the challenge is you have to. It's inherently collaborative because you have to have more than one person participating in this ontology and building this ontology. And there are very, very heavy-handed, heavyweight versions of this underway. You can do this sort of CDP level of formalization if you want to, but there are also much lighter weight kinds of models, which are just really recognizing the inherent complexity of the environments they're trying to navigate, where my organization doesn't look exactly like your organization. So past a certain point, maybe 60%, maybe 80%, maybe 40%, my information just doesn't immediately map to yours. Now, maybe you can still make use of it. I'll share it on that basis. Maybe I can still make use of yours. I'll consume yours on that basis. But there's going to be a certain burden on me to make sense of the other stuff that's coming in from you that's outside of this common core where I automatically know that we're on the same page around what these pieces of information mean. And that's, I mean, the sort of, it's easy to talk either or here. It's easy to talk hub and spoke or, BitTorrent, right? But the most fertile ground in every field that I've seen is in the middle somewhere, right? There's some effort to create and curate, because it requires constant maintenance and upkeep, an ontology for what you're trying to share. But there's also a very deliberate rejection of too much centralization, too much formalism. There's a lot of deliberate room left for innovation and expansion and idiosyncrasy around the edges. And those models seem to perform better on average. The CDP is the exception that proves the rule. I mean, without constant, intensive financial support from a committed funder, the failure rate on these hub and spoke projects is almost literally 100%, right? Because they are impossible to self-sustain. The curation costs are so high, the benefits are so diffuse, that when the minute that somebody stops funding, data quality starts deteriorating. Once data quality starts deteriorating, you're in a death spiral because fewer people come, which means fewer people have incentives to update the data, which means data quality gets worse, which means fewer people come, and on you go.
What are some other examples of this, though, that have died?
Oh, I mean, you can actually go out on the web and look up Digital Humanities Tools Portal. You'll find several hundred. And it's astonishing how fast they unravel. Sometimes it's 90 days after the funding stopped, and basically everybody's stopped coming. We've done some interesting work around, in fact, the problem is so pervasive and so difficult to solve. It really is incredibly difficult to solve this problem. Until you're Facebook, until 400 million people are showing up, and the curation cost of the information that you're sharing is zero, right? Because it's just, hi, I'm here, right? And people are just doing it anyway. It's for them it's an emotional rush of some kind. But the models that are also interesting is where you're not sharing data necessarily, you're sharing information. The projects have done some interesting things around creating communities of practice in which you don't necessarily go out and look for data as an answer to the question. You go out and look for a person who knows about this. And that person serves as the curator of the information. Rather than having to physically curate the information, for which they're usually not paid and don't have the time or the passion, it's simply the fact that they're expert and they can aggregate that information for you in a conversation or an email or something like that rather quickly. And that's an interesting kind, and this is what I mean about the middle, right? There's lots of different middles here. There's the middle of the sort of the friends of a friend approach, where there's sort of a loose ontology. But there's also this notion of a middle ground where where we're sharing information by establishing human connections. And we let the human beings proxy for the data, in effect, in those networks, because it's more efficient. And because we get positive incentives out of connecting to another human being that we really don't get out of connecting to a data set.
And speaking of connecting to human beings, I'm going to throw it over to Justin and take some questions from our online participants.
Great. So I would say my favorite question so far, I'll do a little curation here myself, is from Jess Hutchinson, who asks, I'd also love to hear examples of what Barbara mentions as strategies to help small organizations understand how to share and not give with limited resources.
I think when you get your participants to understand that the data is used for advocacy purposes, and advocacy in all senses of the word, but let's talk about government advocacy, when that becomes a priority, I think then you get a lot of people stepping up. But I think that if an organization has access to the data and can get information back, whether it's like-sized organizations, so the comparative that we talked about, I think you have to teach groups sometimes how to do that.
Yeah.
And once you do that, and it becomes a useful tool internally for planning, for strategic work, for work with the board of directors, then you're going to get a lot more participation.
I think at the CDP that we definitely see there's this gap of, well, what would I do? I mean, you know, if I have a database of 10,000 organizations, we have comparison reports that organizations can run, but we're finding that we need to do a lot more facilitation to help people really get in there and ask questions of the data, and there is a big need for that kind of facilitation. It's a big issue.
It's also, I mean, flipping what Barbara said around a little bit too, there's this issue that if you're really going to make effective use of this information, organizational transformation is almost an inescapable part of this. Organizations that are really effective at enabling and engaging in and benefiting from data sharing do not look like organizations built on the traditional siloed model. Right? At least if they do, they're really leaving a lot of potential wins on the table.
How do they look differently?
They tend to be more porous to the outside world in a lot of ways. There are more direct connections between external stakeholders and the people inside the organizations. There is a much clearer understanding up to the board level of what is involved with data sharing, what the benefits, costs, and risks are, and a much more, there's usually, I mean, you can't say anything with absolute certainty, but there's usually a much stronger organizational understanding of shared mission around these things. Now, cause and effect is a little tricky here. Is it the fact that does data sharing help you understand your mission better, or do the organizations that understand their missions better share data more easily? Chicken and egg, perhaps, but it's visible, and it's so visible that if you get organizations that are sharing data in a cluster within a larger market, within about 18 months, they will literally accelerate away from the rest of the organizations in that market in terms of the sophistication with which they approach their missions, to the point where they can actually have trouble having conversations with people who aren't doing that kind of thing. So there's a Darwinian element here too that I think a lot of people overlook. It's not just when are they going to come for your organization, it's when are the other organizations out there going to start eating your lunch around this.
I think there's also, I mean, the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance is a really good example of, you know, or a service organization, say, coming in and taking a leadership role and really helping people understand the power of data sharing. I know you have all, you know, your space project in Philadelphia is related to this, where I think that organizations in the Greater Philadelphia area are learning a lot of lessons really quickly about sort of collective action, and you know, the CDP is there and the Cultural Alliance, and they've had such an impact. So, you know, I don't know that there's one particular cultural organization that is stepping ahead of the pack, but they're sort of all, I think, being lifted up through that.
I think there is a certain amount of, I mean, we've been talking about the onus of whoever's collecting the data in terms of educating the people who are contributing to that data about how they can get something out of it, or what use it's going to be for them. But I also think there's a certain amount of onus on the organization that's contributing data to ask, how can I use this? How is this going to help me? Because so many of them are asked to contribute data by service organizations. So they feel a certain professional pressure to contribute to that data as a member of that organization, that service organization, or maybe they're asked by funders to contribute particular types of data, so they feel pressured to contribute the data without ever thinking that there's a quid pro quo, that there's a reverse effect. You know, they don't even perceive that it's sharing, they only perceive that it's giving. So I think it's, to answer the question of what's an example of something small organizations can do, they can simply ask, how can I use your data?
And that's part of the transformation process too.
Yeah.
Because if you're not prepared to, I mean, most service organizations would be thrilled to share the data back to their members. But if the members aren't prepared to consume it, then it really is just giving on their part, right? I mean, it's transformation on both sides of the equation.
Justin, did you have other questions?
Sure. I've got, I'm going to merge two questions here a little bit. One is from Alas Kathleen, the other is from Joe Ventures. Alas Kathleen asks, I'm curious about what the royalty implications of putting full shows on YouTube would be. And Joe Ventures suggests it's easy to think about what's meant by content. Are we all on the same page about what is meant by data?
No, and we don't want to go there.
Okay. In terms of royalties on YouTube, well, again, it depends on the production company and the show, but it's a lot. just to be like simplified right there. There have been full shows broadcasted on YouTube. I don't, God bless them for doing it. I really can't speak to the royalties of those particular shows, but
Shows that did it legally? Shows that did it themselves?
Shows that did it themselves. Mm-hmm.
You would think it would almost have to be just a waiver from the participants, because otherwise, I mean, you get 10 million views on YouTube, and you can bankrupt somebody.
Right. I mean, it's become a major issue, Broadway, the negotiation.
Well, this is, but that's the critical word there is negotiations, because the royalty implications of anything are simply what we've agreed the royalty implications of that thing will be. Now, there are a lot of rigidities here. There are union issues, there are all kinds of expectations, all kinds of notions of entitlement that surround these things. But this gets back to the recording industry conversation again, right? I mean, ultimately, the royalty implications of that are going to be whatever the royalty implications of that are going to be, because it's going to happen. And so perhaps the better way to think about that is not what are the royalty implications of doing it today, but what would royalty arrangements need to look like in order to make this optimally beneficial for all of the stakeholders in that production.
Yeah.
In terms of the Joe Ventures question, which I think is a good one,
Which to
restate was, we all, I think we're all in agreement, or we all understand what is meant by content, but are we all on the same page in terms of what the word data means? And I'm remembering that was the first question you asked, what do we mean by data? And I don't know if we ever actually really answered it.
Can I complicate it too and say, when does data become content?
Sure, because there is a
Absolutely, we've been sort of
When does it become information?
Yeah,
right.
So, I can tell you the kinds of data that we're interested in for our work. We're interested in financial data, similar to the stuff that CDP is interested in, and how do we measure the sort of financial health of the field as a whole, and also how do you compare your organization to other similar organizations. We're certainly interested in the kind of event data that you're talking about. I dream of a day when you only have to list your event, one place, and magically it's everywhere.
I'm totally in your dream.
Yeah, right. In more ways than that. And maybe you list your event two places, and what mechanisms do we have to ensure that some automated spidering system can determine that those are actually two listings of the same event, right? Other kinds of data, marketing data, right? Data on audience members, data on donors, data on kind of individual supporters of an organization's work, and what about big list projects that kind of do big collaborative mailing list and facilitate this kind of sharing of that stuff? Those have seen had a lot of success, somewhat I think excitingly and sort of counterintuitively. What else? What am I missing?
If you're looking for maximal bang for the buck as a mission-driven organization, the thing that isn't on that list that probably should actually be first on that list in terms of really, minimal investment, maximal performance enhancement, is sharing practices and outcomes. You simply say, what did we do? How did it work? If you can find a way to systematically share that information with other peer organizations, you take a huge step toward evolving an understanding of best practices for given context.
Is that data or content?
It's information.
It's information, right? This is why I find
I would argue that's data.
Well, this is why I don't want to have that argument. Whatever it is.
Be quantifiable.
Well, we all know there's a such thing as qualitative data. You
Right.
know, there's quantitative data, there's
Yeah,
qualitative
but,
data.
right. But there are folks who get tenure by splitting these hairs, and
Sure.
I don't want to really join them. I mean, I don't honestly care what you call it. If you reliably share, I mean, you call it data, call it Aunt Susie. If you reliably share this information with your peer organizations and receive that information from them in return, 2 years from now, you will be a higher performing organization than you are today.
Right.
You know, I mean, I will say that with complete confidence because it literally, if you really look at that information, you will not be able to avoid changing the way that you practice in response to what you've learned.
So I think that's a great point. And actually, one of my other sort of fantasies is that, you know, as we're developing all of this software to help arts organizations sort of manage their businesses more effectively, you know, by providing a system that has sort of sane defaults but also is highly configurable, you know, how do we collect information on different ways that people do things and then start to figure out, you know, what are the sort of best practices, not the conventional wisdom, but what actually works,
Right. And where.
and where, and maybe even why.
Let's not get too
Really what all right, forget the why. But what works and when? And, you know, and then how does that then inform the next iteration of the software? Can those kind of best practices, you know, become the new defaults, right? For the folks who aren't really going to be thinking all that much about how they configure it. I mean, I think that's where you get into really tremendous potential to really kind of change the way an industry functions.
And note what hasn't had to happen here. We haven't had to spend lots of money disidentifying data because we're not sharing data about our patrons, right? We haven't had to spend a lot of time worrying about individually identifying information because we're not sharing that. We're sharing practices and outcomes. This is what happened. This is what we did. This is what happened as a result. This is what we think was important about the state of the world under which we did it. Right? Those three pieces of information, which are pretty cheap compared to a lot of the other kinds of information that organizations generate, have disproportionate benefits when shared compared to all of these other. I mean, in a sense, we spend 80% of our time agonizing around 20% of the benefit of data sharing. Okay, with apologies to the people who are spending their whole lives sharing those kinds of data right now. I mean, the high value data that organizations share is data about how they operate.
It's interesting, the author of the book Charitable, I cannot remember his name. I was sitting in on a webinar last week where he called for a magnificent national assessment system or something where, you know, people would sort of go in and, you know, log their outcomes and things like that as a counterweight to systems that do sort of a more rote evaluation of an organization's effectiveness based on its share of, you know, income spent on fundraising, you know, that very contentious area where charities are getting, you know, rated. And, you know, it's calling for this more. Why are we not sharing our outcomes, you know, on a national level? And I wonder who's going to step forward and do that.
Well, the point is not to share. I'm not talking about sharing it with prospective funders. I mean, I'm talking about sharing it with other peer organizations, right? And can funders look at it? Sure, because if you're really engaged in one of these sharing environments, pretty soon you're going to be pretty attractive to anybody who's looking seriously. I mean, the issue about, you know, we raised this at the very beginning talking about, you know, CDP, that arts organizations don't want to show their books to people. But the truth is, as a recovering funder, I can say this with some authority, is that most funders respond very, very favorably to transparency in an organization's activities, right? You know, we all know that nobody's laundry is entirely clean. We all know that, you know, you look at any organization closely enough, you will find warts. Let's keep going on metaphors here.
That's three.
That's right. Thank you. I'm just getting started. But, you know, and so this thing that when you're holding that information and you're sure that if people saw this, they would think you were the worst nonprofit organization in the history of the world and they would never give you a dime. is in fact the organization that's the information that's much more likely to unlock significant resources for your organization, because when people see you, they are better able to trust you.
I mean, while I agree that, you know, sharing best practices, you know, and what's successful is, you know, a great bang for the buck in terms of data sharing. You know, something that Chad Bauman brought up at National Arts Marketing Project Conference back in November was that we so often don't share what didn't work.
Yeah.
Which could be equally or
And
sometimes more beneficial, especially in a new area or a new stage.
And so trust, I mean, trust is a word that shows up a lot in data sharing environments, right? Because you have to be able to trust people if you're going to say what didn't work, if you're going to report null results, if you're going to report negative results. You know, we tried this. We spent, you know, umpty-ump dollars on it, and as far as we can tell, absolutely nothing happened.
Well, that goes back to the fear and getting other participating organizations to buy in. If you're like, well, it failed miserably last year, but this time I think we fine-tuned it. So
I'm kind of interested in the mechanism for sharing the data or the information or the best practices or the what didn't work. I mean, we've all a million times heard somebody say, well, I never knew about that.
That's right. That's right.
What are we doing right and what are we not doing right to get the word out and to share that? You know, there's umpty million websites and this is and that's is, but what's working, what isn't working, and what can we do to make it better?
I mean, I think that's a lot of what Fractured Atlas does. That's a lot of what we do on the technology side, right? Sort of, this can be a very expensive, especially on the scale of an entire sector, it can be a very expensive, well, the CDP knows this very well, you know, a really expensive endeavor if you want to allow groups to share information. And how do you do it? What's sort of the path of least resistance? What's the low-hanging fruit? I don't know.
It's only just.
Yeah, right, I know. But there is, you know, if we at least got to a point, because we've talked about sort of the shared data model, right? That, you know, an organization, sort of the profile of an organization as a bunch of pieces of data is, you know, it's the first name, it's like the legal name, it's the address, it's the phone number in this format. Like, even just getting to that point would be transformative, I think, for a sector. So that's just scratching the surface of a very large conversation.
Justin, you have questions?
We have 3 questions. One is a little apropos of what you guys are talking about right now. It is from Joe Ventures, and he says,
Go Joe!
And he says, we thought about Web 3.0 semantic web technologies. And he says national providers are interested in similar types of data. Are they working with one another, standardize and accept data through more open means, which I presume he means by, you know, processes like that, like the Web 3.0 stuff?
No, we're not working together. Yes, we should be working together. There are only, you know, there aren't that many organizations in the field that really do this stuff in a big way.
In the arts.
In the arts, yes,
right.
In the arts.
It's very different in different sectors.
Yes, that may be, but I don't care about the arts.
All right.
Let's get that straight. But really, there are only a few of us, and it's kind of it seems to me like it should be extremely easy. It obviously isn't, but it should be.
Spoken like a man who's never been the delegate to a standards making.
Right, exactly. Right. But we should be able to, you know, sit around a table, virtual or real, and at least have a dialogue about, you know, how are we going to describe X information, and how are we going to publish it and consume it, so that we're not constantly duplicating each other's effort and making the same constituents enter the same information in different ways for each of us. It's kind of, you know, I'm confident that there are just enormous wasted sort of, you know, human effort, resources on this because we can't, because we haven't done this yet.
I agree with you about the wasted resources, but I disagree strongly that if what you're proposing, and it was a little bit implicit, so maybe you meant something different, but if what you're proposing is sort of a grand summit of arts organizations, I think that's a tremendous way to waste an awful lot of money and time and accomplish virtually nothing. I think that, and this gets back, Barbara has raised this question several times, and it's a really good question, and we keep kind of dodging it on her, I think, a little bit. But this issue of...
Asking it for 30 years.
All right, good. So we're in good company, I guess. But if you really want to build a standard for a field, by far the most productive way to do it is start with 2 or 3 close friends and build a standard for yourselves that generates.
Well, so I started by saying
start
there's only
growing that as a de
Yeah,
facto standard.
absolutely.
Right? But don't try. First of all, I mean, the grand summit approach has a number of problems. One is it tends to be taken over by people who love to have conversations about data protocols, right? And these are not people who like to get work done. So there is almost inevitably nothing of value results from these. I mean, the best case is that people ignore it and go do what they need to do to get the work done.
Mm-hmm.
The worst case is that these abstract protocols impose all kinds of unintended constraints because the people doing them, you learn what you need to share and how you need to share it by sharing it. There is no, a bunch of people who have never shared data before cannot come into a room together and construct the perfect ontology out of their heads.
Well, I totally agree, and I honestly think there are probably no more than maybe 5 tops organizations that would kind of seriously be interested in this and have something to contribute, and really probably it's more like 3.
So why not start with 1? Is my point, right? I mean,
well, but I think there's a difference between 1 and 3.
I mean, that has happened in our field.
Yeah.
NEA set standards that were adopted by state arts agencies, that were adopted by local arts agencies around the field of granting in the arts. And so, I mean, that's my question is grassroots, everybody getting together at the table, going to bring us all there? Or is it really going to have to be someone who can leverage quite a bit in the field?
Nothing is going to bring us, no one thing is going to bring us all there.
Yeah.
Grassroots is not going to do it, top down is not going to do it. There is an iterative, sort of almost evolutionary process over time that gets more of us there than just about any other way I've seen. And it starts with grassroots, because if you don't know what you're doing by doing it, starting at the top with this is almost always a disastrous idea. But you start at the grassroots level. At a certain point, there is enough sort of stability to what you've evolved as a de facto standard that you can then flip it and take it to an NEA level and think about implementing it as a policy. But at that point, that policy had better be implemented in a fashion that isn't too heavy-handed so that grassroots innovation around it can continue. And you sort of flip back and forth between the grassroots and the top-down. And that, over time, gets you closer than anything else I've seen. But there's no nirvana, and the pursuit of nirvana is one of the most dangerous things that goes on in these processes.
Because you never accomplish anything.
Or you accomplish something that's your nirvana, but not mine.
Right.
And we're worse off than we were before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just to try to be the optimist here, Adam. Like we are sort of getting there a little bit. I don't know. I mean, we at the Alliance at least adopt data fields that we know are coming from the CDP. We don't put out a survey that asks an organization to categorize itself in a different way that we know they just had to tell the CDP, and a year from now we're going to be doing a study using that data and trying to put databases together. And anything that we do with you, we're going to sort of respect those, that same structure. So I think in the same way that like you can't have that nirvana for the entire sector, I think we also can expect that all of a sudden all 3 of us are going to be doing everything the same, but maybe there's this piece and we see how that works and we see how we're sharing it, and then we throw some stuff out and then we go to like the next piece of data.
Right. Yeah, and absolutely. And you can start, very small, right? So you can say you've got an event calendar, we've got event ticketing software that we're building, right? Let's make sure that the way your XML or JSON or whatever the heck it is describes an event is the same way that ours does, so that maybe there's a use case where things are automatically being sent to you and you're automatically consuming them, or vice versa.
Right. Justin.
We have 2 more questions, which I will keep you guys together so you can just keep talking. One is Jess Hutchinson asks, what does everybody in the room feel, how do you all feel about big list efforts, and how will they work? And then Ian David Moss, who's sitting next to me, asked, what about extensible standard structures? I think this is a follow-up to what Chris was talking about, the idea that we could come up with a core of essential data, but then lots of optional fields could be developed later for those who need them. This also sort of runs hand in hand with Joe Venture's Web 3.0 semantic web questions, the ability to add on to things that are there.
I think the point I would make to start about this is that the arts are coming not incredibly late to this conversation, because a lot of people have lagged coming to this conversation, but there are certainly fields and areas out there that have been thinking about this for a long time and have made a tremendous amount of progress, and it's probably not advantageous to the arts to try and reinvent all that progress, right? I mean, there are good design patterns out there for how you build extensible standards around these sorts of things. Does the arts really need to come up with another? Probably not. Does the arts need to tailor what they're doing? To tailor those other things to what they're doing? Absolutely. But there's a world of difference between tailoring and
Recreating the wheel.
Exactly. So, in that sense, I think these are all conversations that other fields have had. Some of them have had immensely productive conversations. In some, there are large bodies of evidence about the pros and cons of various approaches and the costs of various approaches that I think would be very valuable for arts organizations before they start taking plunges in various directions around data sharing. And it's because these people all share data, it's free. I mean, the information's out there. You can. And it gets to another dimension of data sharing that we haven't talked much about, which is who you share data with. A little bit of allusion to it in terms of, Philly is doing this kind of bootstrapping the community. And community level sharing is one way to get started. It's one way to scale down the problem to tractability. Another way is to find peer organizations that are intentionally not in your market, because that way you get rid of all the competitive dynamics that can, the Met has a whole bunch of patrons. I'm making this up. The Met, I imagine, has a whole bunch of patrons that spend part of their year in Santa Fe. So the Met and the Santa Fe Opera work out a data sharing arrangement that allows them to provide a more seamless, more beneficial, richer experience to their patrons, because sometimes they're here and sometimes they're there.
Or sharing among those organizations in a geographic corridor that are not the same.
Right.
For example, maybe you have the opera sharing information with a theater on the other side of town, or a gallery, or,
And there is no one right answer, in the sense that different types of data, it will be easier to use these different models for different types of data, right?
Right.
Ticketing data, if you're not doing it, certain kinds of information about your patrons is only valuable geographically. Other kinds of information about your patrons is valuable much more by genre or by sector than it is by geography, right? And this gets back to the need to transform the organization, because if you're really going to be effective at data sharing, you're probably going to have to share different data different ways. Mm-hmm. And again, if you haven't sort of restructured the organization to allow this, and one of the crucial things in here is devolving authority within the organization, mm-hmm. because one person at the top of the organization can't make all these decisions effectively. So organizations need to start trusting staff to make these decisions for the types of data over which they are the primary owners. And that's a big challenge for a lot of arts organizations, which tend to have very strongly centralized managerial processes.
I want to go back to that first question about big lists.
Yeah.
So the question was, how did people around the table feel about these big list initiatives, and are they successful?
I think they're great. I don't know if they're successful. I don't have direct experience with it either. I've certainly spoken to people who do, and who have had very positive things to say. It's sort of, I find it sort of interesting that they're all focused on sort of snail mail contact information. It's it's almost like so much focus now is on sort of digital space data about people, that it's funny that the sort of largest scale, most effective sharing projects around patron data is sort of Paleolithic information about them. But I would love to see what would happen if they started getting a little bit more sophisticated about the way the sort of profiling and, I don't know.
I mean, there's been some of that in Pittsburgh in terms of with different folks in the downtown area who are sharing information with each other to the point where it's starting to become, you know, people who purchase this ticket are likely to also be interested in this or this. And it's taking time.
But
you know,
that
it's
Pittsburgh
taking
model is
time.
gaining traction.
It is,
A lot of
yeah.
people are looking at it closely right now.
And the data is starting to aggregate over time, so there's, you know, there's more validity to it, because as it keeps going, there's more data, there's more qualitative approach to the data.
I think it seems like businesses built on this model are driving the effectiveness and adoption of it. And what I mean by that is, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like a piece of software. Well, Google Analytics might be one, right? It's the idea of like, I'm going to give a little bit of information because, and it's giving something up, but it's contributing to sort of the greater good.
Intuit is doing the same thing with QuickBooks now. If you do your QuickBooks online and you share your business's financial information disidentified, then you get business intelligence from all other QuickBooks customers who can
Facebook
test marketing. I don't know that they roll it out.
Facebook has aspects of this, right? I mean,
But I'm thinking about QuickBooks. It's interesting because most of these others are fairly lightweight. You know, the sort of Facebook stuff is, you know, but this is right down to the heart of the administrative day.
What do you mean by that though? With that the Facebook stuff is.
What do you mean by lightweight?
Well, if I can jump in, I kind of relate this to marketing efforts that we've done, because we're getting into contextual versus behavioral targeting now, where you could, and for example, with sorry, I'm a marketer, so I'm going to have to relate this to marketing.
It's okay, we forgive you.
Yeah.
Snake.
Yeah, right. Hey, I'm good at spending money. What do you want? So, anyways, but a lot of what we do is a lot like Google Display Network, for example. Is you can take, if you're trying to target an arts patron, XYZ arts patron, we can either target our ads based on sites that are relevant to other arts interests, groups, whatnot. Maybe somebody on one of those sites of similar interest will see your theater's ad and go, oh, okay, that's in my area, click on it, buy the ticket, etc. Or what if we drop a cookie? You came to our website, you touched upon us already, but now you're going to sports, and you're going to the weather, and you're going in your CNN, and you like to read the Huffington Post. How do we could also follow you, and because now we've tagged you, let's see if we can serve you that ad to be like, wait, can you buy our ticket again?
Right.
So that's.
So the Met has, the Met Museum and Met Opera have their fan pages, right? They are giving over information about their audience numbers to Facebook so that Facebook can then target other groups' ads to their people. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by, that's sort of the big list happening without them really even knowing it. And that's really valuable information. Right. You know, it's really valuable.
Absolutely.
Sort of,
log into your Facebook profile and look at the right 3 ads on the side column of what you're being targeted.
Yeah.
That
exactly.
You're sharing.
It has to do that I'm a member of all these arts groups, or, you know, I'm of a certain sexual orientation and therefore I am valuable to you, and I'm a member of a big list all of a sudden, you know.
Justin, question?
Yes, from William Valentine. The question is, how about data sharing internationally? RE, geographically based licensing, political censorship, etc.?
Again, it depends. You know, some data crosses borders really nicely. Sharing data about your practices and outcomes incurs no essential political fallout from any place. I mean, there are half a dozen nations on Earth where you'd run into serious trouble with that, and the rest of it is pretty non-controversial. Sharing any information with individual components to it runs into a whole network of inconsistent laws governing privacy and identity that makes it risky. But, you know, international data, I mean, the projects we do are all international. We've got people in every country except North Korea, I think, and who knows, maybe we've got people in North Korea. And, you know, people working on these projects in 17 time zones, so they don't seem to have any trouble sharing the information. Again, it's really about to whom, what, and if you are sending information that has potential policy implications, like contact information, like a lot of marketing information, but not all, then you really better know the law, and you better get a good set of international lawyers if you are the kind of organization that's likely to attract any kind of attention around that activity. But for most arts organizations, most of the time, sharing most kinds of information that would really be valuable for them to share, it's probably not that big a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we're in the middle of doing a survey of arts managers around the world right now regarding ticketing software and how satisfied they are with the choices they've made around it. And because that's the kind of data we're collecting right now, and it's okay. You know, it's okay that we've got people in Australia filling out the survey, and people in Great Britain, and people here, and in Japan. It's all fine, you know, because it's not any of these policy implications, thankfully.
I mean, technically, because you're doing the survey, you run into some issues. Your website needs to be accessibility compliant. Correct. According to the standards of the nation in which you're conducting this. You know, I mean, correct. If you're doing any kind of business, you know, if you're doing international business, the best advice to give anyone is, you know, get a good attorney first. You know, but once you're past that, there really aren't huge challenges around this. And why would you share, for instance, contact information? Right. Of your patrons here in New York City with somebody in Melbourne? I mean, I'm willing to hear a use case where that's valuable, but I'm having trouble kind of coming up with one.
Anybody else want to chime in on international? Okay.
Well, from a tourist perspective for us, I think there are possibilities. I'll just say that. I mean, you know, so data sharing, like, one thing that's come to mind during this conversation is there are things, you know, we are competing with whatever Arts Alliance in Paris, but that's a feeder market for New York. They're interested in sort of arts audiences in New York. Yeah. You know, what can be accomplished. Sure.
There are ways to do that, though, that don't require you to share. I mean, again, you don't want to get into a situation where, you know, oh, we've got this data sharing hammer, you look like a nail, right? I mean, maybe the right solution for a market situation like you're describing, a Paris to New York connection, is that you make your ads available to corresponding arts organizations in Paris who take responsibility for targeting them to their own audiences. That way you're not sharing anything that has any legal or policy issues. And you've solved the problem without getting, you know, teams of really expensive attorneys involved. Right.
That's more in line with collaboration and
Right, but you're still sharing information and you're sharing data. That's just there's usually more than one way. You know, in computing, we talk about taking the data to the computation versus taking the computation to the data. Right, when you're dealing with really large grid scale problems, you know, global network problems. Sometimes because transmitting information is so expensive, it's actually cheaper to move the computer to where the data is than it is to move the data across the wire to where you are. And lots of parallels in data sharing to that kind of calculus where, you know, we have a need to share information. The data is not information, there's a difference, right? And so we need to be really thoughtful about how many different ways can we structure data sharing to accomplish the information sharing that's our actual objective. Right.
I think also in terms of international, just somewhat out of the context of this conversation, but discipline-specific data sharing actually could be just as relevant, if not more relevant, you know, say in the opera sector. You know, European opera companies maybe have more to do with the Metropolitan Opera than anyone else in the CDP, for example. You know, so I think that there, you know, with certain types of data, not at the patron level, but in other areas.
And you do, I mean, you'll find that most European countries have moved farther along on data sharing internally within the organizations, and the EU itself is making some strides in that regard. But that's a mixed blessing, right? On the one hand, you've got all this structure that you're going to have to play with because those organizations have to play with it. You've also got, it's cost and benefit. The cost is, you can't just going and doing an ad hoc data sharing arrangement with a European arts organization is correspondingly harder because they've already got systems in place and they'd really prefer to use those, thank you very much. But if you can find a way to map what you're doing to what they already have, you're able to play not just with that one organization, but with the dozens to hundreds of other organizations in the nation or in the EU that are using that same data model. Mm-hmm. So.
Question?
Ron Evans, who's no longer on the chat, and Jess Hutchinson and Alex Gray all suggest that you guys need to find a data sharing standard for cookies, which are not being properly shared.
I tried, I did my best.
I own a couple because of it.
Thanks, Ron.
I mean, that's not just a sentence.
Yeah. And are these lips? That's really what's been on my mind.
That's right. Plastic.
Jess Hutchinson suggests it's like putting a loaded gun on the stage at the beginning of the first act.
These are actually, it's a green screen. Those are actually virtual movies.
Right.
That's it for us.
Closing thoughts?
Hold on, let me give, they're about 2 minutes behind us. I'll give them a chance to do the last question.
All right.
So I guess a question. How do we move forward in terms of going back to the idea of, well, it has to start at the grassroots before it can flip to a top-down and go back and forth. How do we start, or how do we, assuming that we're not starting, assuming that there's already momentum in play, how do we accelerate momentum?
I'll get a little zen about this because I get asked a lot about how to build data sharing communities, and the best advice I can give about it is forget about the technology. People usually come because they want recommendations about, oh, we've got this global community that wants to share data and we need to know what the platform needs to be. There are really effective technology platforms that will support global scale data sharing that costs $3 a person a year. Technology is not your bottleneck here. The real bottleneck is the trust relationships. If you don't have viable trust relationships weaving together people who gain mutual benefit from sharing information, then you don't have a viable data sharing environment. It doesn't matter what data you're talking about, where you're going. And this is why I keep coming back to start small and find somebody with whom there's a mutual value proposition. And really just grow into understanding all the different ways that data sharing can benefit your organization. Nobody comes to this as a rational exercise and just sort of says, okay, today we're going to start sharing all this data. Very few organizations have even a remotely accurate assessment before they start of how much value data sharing is going to generate for them. And so the best way to do it is to start small, limit your risk exposure, limit your liability, find somebody you trust already, and then bring in a few others and learn what's necessary in order to extend trust to other entities. You do that, and you'll find that there are other pods of entities like you that are doing that out there, and you start building pods of pods. And pretty soon you've got an archipelago of of communities of practice that have done this. And there is no shortcut. People who try to do this by building centralized technology platforms and the sort of, we call it the field of dreams fallacy. If we build it, they will come. Well, they may come, but they're not going to stay. And this is, people waste insane amounts of time and effort and money on these projects. And because when you go and look at it, and it's one of the reasons too that projects don't replicate well. Because if you look at a successful project, if you look at what's happening in Philly, or if you look at what's happening in Pittsburgh, people will go in and they'll look at all the measurable aspects of this. But nobody's going to be able to measure the trust relationships in Philly or Pittsburgh, right? Nobody's going to be able to measure the human capital that's been built up among people over time who have learned that sharing this information with these other people brings good, not bad, to them. And you could take and transplant Philly or Pittsburgh into another city right now without taking the time to build those relationships, and I guarantee you the identical model will fail.
Justin.
We have one last question, but I've called in a last call of questions. This is the only one left. Big lists to produce actionable information and knowledge. Are we at the point yet where we can say the same thing about the data sharing we're talking about in this conversation? That's from Joe Ventures.
Well, Joe, I think that depends because we've been talking about lots of different types of data sharing. Yeah, so I mean, I think it depends. Well, let's think about the types of data sharing we have been talking about.
The question was, are there actionable outcomes?
Well, I think, have they provided results
I think
that
he's
allow
looking for
people
the
to
killer,
take action?
the killer app for data sharing, right? I mean, is there some sort of compelling use case story out there where data sharing? There are lots of little stories, but the replicability of the communities is one of the challenges there. I can tell you wonderful stories out of our projects, but that doesn't mean that you can go out tomorrow and mimic those projects exactly and achieve the same results, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know that there's a killer app. I think, in fact, when you talk to nonprofits, mission-driven organizations that are considering joining one of our community sourcing projects, they will spend all of their time talking to you about how much money they hope to save. And you can save a lot of money in these projects. If you talk to those same organizations 18 months, 2 years, 3 years into participating in one of these communities, it's often the case that the money doesn't even make the top 5 list of benefits that they've generated. But the kinds of benefits that they've generated are not necessarily the kinds of benefits that you want to lead to the annual report to the trustees and it's stuff like we had these people who were just lost and now they're deeply engaged and much more passionate about their work. It's things like, because we've been able to see what other organizations like ours do in the way of practices, we now have an organization that is substantially more best practices oriented than it was 2 years ago. And the performance and productivity results we're seeing are remarkable, but they're not attributable in some clean way to this intervention or that intervention, right? So the killer app, to my mind, from data sharing is right in front of us, but it's incredibly hard to see. And it's just the organizational transformation that results and the improved capacity of organizations to achieve mission that results from an environment in which data sharing is just an innate part of how the organization understands its pursuit of mission.
I'm going to just come at this from a totally different perspective for a second, which is to say that I think to almost kind of jumpstart the conversation and jumpstart the people sort of even just starting to think about this stuff, I would be inclined to start with data where the trust is not an issue, right? Again, I keep coming back to event listing data, right? It's sort of a stupid, simple use case, but it's an obvious one in a sense, in that people not only don't feel proprietary about it, they have an incentive to get it out there. And we're making it hard for them to do that, or harder than it has to be, because we haven't agreed, those of us who publish event listings, and that would be everything from a newspaper to an online calendar to whatever, we haven't agreed on simple, ways to simplify that process. So, from my perspective, another place to start would be to have again, not a grand summit, but 2 or 3 organizations that deal with event listing data in the arts get together and start by saying, okay, here's how we represent this internally. How do you represent it internally? How do you represent it internally? Okay, what are the common fields that we all have?
It's kind of like taking Project Audience to the next level. Project Audience is a conversation that's been going on around issues like this, but hasn't quite gotten to that level of specificity regarding the data that the organizations talking with one another are actually collecting or putting out there.
The only caveat I would say is that no amount of untrusted data sharing accumulates into trusted data sharing, right? You can do that and it's a win, and it's sort of low-hanging fruit. You can get it today, but it doesn't necessarily get you any closer to these trust-based relationships where most of the business value lies.
But once you have that trust, at least you have the system.
You've built the relationships and you've started to build some protocols and some systems and things like that, which I just think it lays some groundwork I agree. It doesn't solve,
Maybe, but
it doesn't
maybe
solve the hard
it's
problem.
more like a jobs board, right? Lots of people share data on job listing boards right now. It doesn't actually accumulate to much of anything in terms of organizational capacity beyond that. People compartmentalize these things really easily, you know, and that's why I say sort of trust first is almost the only way to make these things make any sense.
I would say trust and basic information sharing. You touched upon an interesting point when we were talking about international database sharing, and just thinking back again, sort of how we gather here in the city. We have travel and tourist bureaus. They gather the information. They work with the hotels. They work with other industries, entertainment industries, to sort of give us a top line scope of, well, okay, and Google Analytics is another important tool where you can just basically look and say, you know, might find out that this particular show or venue has a very strong international following or demographic, and you can start from there, and that's where you can start that conversation of reaching out to maybe that service organization in that area, or you can see if there's some sort of symbiotic relationship that could be fostered from that.
It's also, in that kind of context too, there's so much value to creating systems that surface certain kinds of information more readily. So imagine, I mean, we've talked at several points, Project Audience had conversations about, imagine linking concierges into this, so that, I mean, who knows better who's actually asking for what kinds of tickets than the hotel desks, right? If you have to poll them to get that information, it's unwieldy. I mean, maybe one or two people can afford to do it, but if you can just generate systems such that that information is just recorded and captured in the normal course of doing business, you're in a very different game in terms of what's feasible to you, in terms of the quality of the information. Cost, I keep going, you know, maybe I'll stop here because, but I'm going to end where I started. Most data sharing arrangements collapse because people have grossly underestimated the curation costs of adequate quality data. And usually the best way to attack the curation cost of data is not to try to impose more efficient ex post curation, but try to improve the efficiency of capture of adequate quality information at the source, so it never has to be touched by anybody else at all.
Well, we're actually attacking it from both ends. I mean, because in order for people to for an organization to even play, to have the conversation and put hours, you know, resources into working with us so that we can capture, you know, we can create systems that capture it, it needs to be worth something to them. So that carrot on the other end, that is the efficiency of the distribution of that content, needs to be there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think about it in terms of CDP, you know, a way to radically transform the cost model around CDP that I've talked with folks about on a couple of occasions. And I'm not suggesting this seriously, this isn't the forum, but just as an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, is if you build a freely licensed accounting system for small arts organizations. Which we're doing. which someone at the table may or may not be doing in the near future. But this is exactly the point. If the system is built as in such a fashion that an arts organization can use it more effectively than what its current options are for accounting systems, and at the same time it makes exposing the information necessary for CDP utterly reliable and almost costless to the organization, then you eliminate several steps of the data curation process in CDP. You can more than pay for the cost of developing that application and giving it away out of the money you save on the curation cost, and you end up with a more sustainable solution going forward. You know, and those kinds of strategies for people who are serious about data sharing are really the long-term successful strategies, right? The little micro movement, it's a collaborative world. If you can't act at a certain scale in these things, you can't achieve the scale benefits. So those kinds of plays become absolutely imperative if you're going to be working to achieve data sharing on some kind of comprehensive basis for the arts as a sector.
Well, thank all of you for joining us today, and thanks to the panel for being here and sharing your thoughts. And trying to get through the quagmire that can be data sharing. And thank you to Fractured Atlas for hosting the conversation.
And thank you
sharing with the
thank you to
field.
David.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So thanks.
Ciao.
Thank you.